Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Navina, and on behalf of Capital Markets Malaysia, it is my pleasure to welcome you all today to this webinar on supply chain sustainability to advance ESG adoption amongst Malaysian SMEs. This program and subsequent ones in the series for SMEs has been organized and hosted by the Ministry of Environment and Water Malaysia and Capital Markets Malaysia, which is an affiliate of the Securities Commission. I'd like to mention some housekeeping details before we get into today's program. The session will last 2 hours and is scheduled to end at 12 noon. If you'd like to pose a question to the workshop leaders, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You will just need to click on that button and type in your question, and it will be addressed by the team. There will also be some poll questions along the way, and we do hope that you will participate in the polls. We have a packed 2-hour program, and we begin with welcome remarks from the host, which will take about 15 minutes, followed by the workshop that will be presented by our delivery partner, Thoughts in Gear. So first up, ladies and gentlemen, our first welcome address is from Datuk Seri Dr. Zaini Ujang, who is Secretary General of the Ministry of Environment and Water, Malaysia.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good morning. Yang berbahagia Datuk Zainal Izlan Zainal Abidin, Chairman Capital Markets Malaysia, distinguished speakers and all participants who are with us today. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation to Capital Markets Malaysia for inviting me to deliver the welcoming address for the kick-off session of this Small Medium Enterprises SME webinar series. CASA is delighted to partner with Capital Markets Malaysia in organizing this webinar series. As the climate change national focal point, CASA is responsible for the development of climate change policies and implementation of climate change initiatives, in line with our country's commitment under the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, and the Paris Agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is a pertinent issue that cannot be ignored, as the impact of climate change-related disasters are felt worldwide. The finding of the first working group report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, published on August 9, 2021, concluded that the global average temperature has recorded an increase of 1.1 degrees Celsius as compared to pre-industrial level. This phenomenon is due to the increase of greenhouse gases, GHG emissions from human activities, leading to unprecedented heat waves, droughts, and floods across the world. Malaysia is also not exempted from the effects of climate change. The recent catastrophic flood that hit the country in December 2021 has impacted the country's economy and livelihood of people in 8 states. The impact is estimated to be Ringgit Malaysia 6.5 billion in economic losses, with at least 125,000 people being displaced and 54 lives were lost. It was recorded as one of the deadliest natural catastrophes in Malaysia since 1971. Latest climate projection for Malaysia indicates that the average annual surface temperature increase ranges from 1.9 to 2.1 degrees Celsius by end of the century. The magnitude of the change of the average annual precipitation in Malaysia is also expected to increase from 14% to 25%, and the sea level is projected to continue rising to about 0.73 meter by the end of the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, recognizing that climate change is posing real threats to Malaysia, hence requiring strong commitment and more concrete actions, the Malaysia Climate Action Council, MyCAC, was established in 2020 and chaired by the Honorable Prime Minister of Malaysia. MyCAC is the country's highest platform to deliberate on climate change issues, as well as determine the direction of climate change agenda at the federal and state levels. I'm also pleased to inform that Malaysia has successfully updated its nationally determined contribution, NDC, under the UNFCCC with an inspirational target to reduce its economy-wide carbon against gross domestic product GDP of 45% in 2030 compared to 2005 level. The pledge was made unconditionally and is 10% higher than our previous target. During the unveiling of the 12th Malaysian Plan on 27 September 2021, the Honorable Prime Minister had announced that Malaysia has set the inspiration to achieve net zero GHG emission target by 2050. The fulfillment of this target is contingent upon the 5 completion of the long-term low emission development strategy, or LTLEDS, currently being developed by CASA and expected to be finalized by the end of 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, to further support the country's climate change agenda, the government is developing a carbon pricing policy. CASA has developed the International Voluntary Carbon Market, or VCM, guidelines as a reference for all stakeholders, including the private sector who wish to participate in carbon credit trading internationally. The government also agreed to develop domestic emission trading scheme that's to be implemented by CASA in collaboration with the Ministry of Finance and Bursa Malaysia. The private sector can leverage on debts to undertake carbon credit transaction at the domestic level to encourage industry's transition to low carbon pathway, as well as to attract more green investment into the country. It will also enhance the competitiveness of local products and services in the global market. Ladies and gentlemen, to support the implementation of the National Climate Change Agenda, the government is strengthening its national climate change governance. Among others, CASA is reviewing the 2009 National Climate Change Policy, developing the National Climate Change Legal Framework, as well as establishing the National GHG Center under CASA this year. The National GHG Center will serve as a central entity that manages GHG inventory-related data to increase transparency in national climate change information reporting. As highlighted by the Honorable Minister of Environment and Water during the high-level segments of UNFCCC COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, the government is also implementing and planning various actions and initiatives that can contribute to the country's NDC commitment, such as increasing renewable energy generation, targeting the procurement of 100% of non-internal combustion engines (ICE) for government fleets by 2030, maintaining at least 50% of the country's forest cover, promoting zero waste and recycling, and low carbon urban development through the Low Carbon Cities Master Plan. Ladies and gentlemen, as part of our strategies to address the climate change issue, the government encourages companies in Malaysia to declare the aspiration of net zero GHG emissions in ensuring the sustainability of the company's operation. Given that small and medium-sized enterprises contribute 38.9% of Malaysia's overall GDP, SME will have an extremely vital role to play in the national climate change agenda. Even the smallest businesses produce carbon emission, whether it's through your premises, the vehicles you use, or your supply chain, for example. By developing an enterprise GHG inventory, you will be able to understand both the direct and indirect impacts of your business operations to the environment. Quantifying your emissions will provide many other benefits for your business, which include saving money and improving your energy efficiency, managing risk, building competitiveness, and your reputation. Businesses have no option but to take stock of their emissions in order to be ahead of others and to be relevant in these challenging times. Therefore, the effort undertaken by the Capital Markets Malaysia is indeed commendable, as this webinar will assist SME in adopting progressively key sustainability and ESG practices in their business. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my hope that by encouraging sectors, industries, organizations, and individuals to work together based on the whole of society and the whole of nation approach in cutting GHG emissions, Malaysia will achieve our net zero commitment and as a consequence help reduce global warming and the effects of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, last but not least, let me again express my sincere appreciation for having me here today. I hope that this webinar series will achieve its goal of raising awareness across various levels of SME on GHG accounting for small businesses. I wish all of you a fruitful discussion. I'm sure SMEs will greatly benefit from the sharing of ideas and expertise and experience throughout this virtual platform. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
On behalf of Capital Markets Malaysia, we would like to thank Datuk Sri Zaini Ujang and his team at CASA for their commitment and dedication to advancing sustainability amongst SMEs. Next, ladies and gentlemen, we hear from the Chairman of Capital Markets Malaysia and Deputy Chief Executive of the Securities Commission Malaysia, Datuk Zainal Islan Zainal Abidin.
Yang berbahagia, Datuk Seri Dr. Zaini Ujang, Secretary General, Ministry of Environment and Water, Malaysia, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum and a very good morning. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to this inaugural engagement marking the collaboration between the Ministry of Environment and Water and Capital Markets Malaysia to provide capacity building support to Malaysian small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, seeking to enhance sustainability practices within their businesses. I'll also wish to thank the esteemed speakers for taking time from their busy schedules to share their expertise and experience in this webinar shortly. For Capital Markets Malaysia, or CMM, this program forms an important component of a key priority for our Centre for Sustainable Corporations to advance the sustainability efforts of Malaysian public listed companies. As CMM continues supporting these companies in their sustainability journey, it is important to ensure that the SMEs, which form part of their supply chains, also move in tandem. Ladies and gentlemen, supply chain sustainability places focus on companies' efforts to uphold environmental and societal values such as climate change, human rights, and fair labor practices throughout their supply chain. The goal is to minimize environmental harm from factors like energy usage, water consumption, and waste management, while having a positive impact on the people and communities in and around their operations. In recent years, customers, investors, and governments have placed increasing pressure on companies to demonstrate greater environmental stewardship and social responsibility. The business case for sustainable operations is now much stronger than ever and will become even more intense over time. Large corporations seeking to meet enhanced sustainability requirements and standards, particularly those which have set net zero carbon targets, must rely on their supply chain and suppliers to follow suit. A 2021 study by Standard Chartered revealed that by 2025, 78% of multinationals or MNCs will remove suppliers that endanger their carbon transition plan. The study, which looks at the risks and opportunities for suppliers in emerging and fast-growing markets as large corporates transition to net zero, also found that MNCs expect to exclude 35% of their current suppliers as they transition away from carbon. More than 2/3 of the 400 MNCs surveyed for the report indicated that, given that supply chain emissions account for an average of 73% of MNCs' total emissions, tackling supply chain emissions is the first step in their net zero transition pathway. This represents both an opportunity and a risk to suppliers. The cost of inaction is extremely high as large corporations race against the clock to achieve their net zero carbon ambitions. Suppliers that do not support the emission reduction target risk being replaced by those able to aid their transition. Conversely, suppliers which take proactive steps to prioritize sustainability are in a better position to retain and attract these large corporate customers. A sustainable supply chain, therefore, is good not only for people and planet, but also for profit as it supports long-term business growth. It creates more partnership opportunities, increases operational efficiency, and raises the organization's profile and reputation. Ladies and gentlemen, under the Capital Market Master Plan 3 or CMP3, covering the period 2021 to 2025, the strategic initiatives that will be undertaken include the following: to enable funding to competitive businesses of all sizes and across every stage of their development, and to enable greater capital mobilization to businesses that create value for various stakeholders of the economy. These two strategic initiatives, alongside others that have been identified in the CMP3, will set a conducive landscape while providing ample opportunity for SMEs to transition their business operations towards meeting the needs and requirements under the global sustainability agenda. For some SMEs, operationalizing a sustainability plan may appear daunting, and it is indeed complex and highly challenging, but at the same time, crucial and unavoidable. And do remember that the SMEs in turn would require their suppliers to similarly embrace the same agenda. Having said that, the objective of our engagement today is to support the SME's sustainability journey. Among the first steps is to acquire the practical knowledge, such as understanding the data requirement that facilitates assessment by existing and potential customers on the SME's state of readiness in becoming suppliers with sound sustainable practices. In this regard, it is heartening to note that over 200 Malaysian SMEs have registered to attend today's session, a clear testament to your commitment in developing sustainable practices within your organizations. I am confident that today's workshop will be beneficial in setting you in the right direction towards attaining these objectives. Before concluding my remarks, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Datuk Sri Zaini Ujang and his team at the Ministry of Environment and Water for this very key collaboration, and more importantly, for their unwavering commitment on advancing Malaysia's climate action objectives and supporting the private sector through initiatives such as this program that we are launching today. With that, I wish all of you a productive and insightful session. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to welcome our delivery partners for this program. Margie Ong is the CEO of Thoughts in Gear, a sustainability and social impact consulting firm. Prior to setting up Thoughts in Gear, Margie worked with Boston Consulting Group, Intel, HCL, and the CIMB Foundation. Margie is joined by Tobias Mangelman, who is Managing Director of Lasaju Consulting. Tobias works closely with and for the private sector, policymakers, and civil society to make economic systems more sustainable. Margie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Navina. And thank you, CMM and CASA. This is an excellent opportunity. All right, ladies and gentlemen, now that you've heard those very encouraging words this morning, it's time to get to work. And here, allow me to share my screen. As Navina mentioned, we have a jam-packed couple hours together this morning. So I'm going to jump right in. Just a reminder that if you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A. We will try our very best to get to it. But keep in mind, we are trying very hard to compress a 16-hour training into less than 2 hours. So let's make sure that we make full use of the time together. And we are so encouraged to see so many SMEs signing up, because truly this session is for you. Now, sustainability at the moment is definitely taking the world by rage for a reason, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And it might seem, as mentioned earlier, it might seem daunting, but to be honest, if you break it down into very actionable steps, it is very doable. And I want to convince each and every one of you. So there's one question typically when we run our extended trainings, there's one question that we always ask companies. And the question we ask is, do you believe that you are already running sustainability initiatives? Of course, those that have been adopting it for 6-7 years, they will know exactly what's going on. But even those that haven't begun thinking about sustainability, which might be some of you out there, rest assured that you are already running sustainability initiatives. I'm an engineer by profession, so I come from the manufacturing floor, and I'm dating myself, but even 25 years ago when I was on the manufacturing floor, we were already running sustainability initiatives in the form of lean manufacturing, in the form of energy efficiency, in the form of increasing productivity. So if you're doing any of those, you are running sustainability. Now, the key thing now is, how do you build upon what you have? How do you know what you have? And how do you ensure that it is aligned to what is expected of you as a company, both from an action perspective, a tracking perspective, a data perspective, and of course, from a reporting perspective. So hopefully this morning, we'll try very hard to demystify what this journey might look like and give you very actionable steps in terms of how to progress through this journey as well. As mentioned, if you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A. So very quickly, in terms of introductions, my name is Margie, and I'm well supported by Kavita and Angelina, and we have a guest speaker with us, Tobias, and he will later on introduce himself in his section. But we are here basically today to ensure that you have a solid set of steps to be able to progress your sustainability agenda after today. Now, what are we going to be covering this morning? So first and foremost, in the first section of this morning, we're going to be talking about an overview of sustainability. So why sustainability is a must for businesses today. And we'll try and cover that relatively quickly. Then we want to talk about 3 things every company needs to know about sustainability. And that's where we get, we take a step back, we get quite basic, but we get a little bit more technical about what you need to know even before starting on this journey. We then go on to the second half of adoption. So once you know the overview of sustainability, the why and the what, we then talk about the how. And we're hoping to be able to spend a little bit more time on this. And we're going to cover this in 2 areas. The first part of that is going to be 8 simple steps in adopting sustainability. And here we're going to break it down into very simply from where you are today, wherever you might be in your adoption process. Either you're extremely early, or you've done this for a couple of years, or you've done this for 6 or 7 years, there is an entry path into these 8 simple steps. Following that, I'll be bringing on Tobias to talk a little bit more specifically about 6 steps in calculating your own GHG emissions. And you know how important that is if you're already being asked for it in the market today. Hopefully we have some time for discussion, and we'll try and make as much time as possible for that. And to speed that up, do type your questions in the Q&A. As mentioned by Navina earlier, we will have poll questions. So there'll be 3 poll questions along the way, and we hope you participate. The poll questions have been designed to help us actually customize this session as we go along, depending on your feedback in the poll today. All right, jumping right in. Okay, word of warning, I'm going to try and talk relatively quickly so we can cover more material. So first and foremost, let's talk about why sustainability is a must for businesses today. And I'm going to try and answer 3 key questions in answering this why question. So the first question we're going to answer is, what's all the fuss about? Why is the world talking about sustainability and ESG? Secondly, we're going to talk about, okay, now that I understand that, but who's looking out for it? Why would I pay attention to it? And thirdly, as an SME and as a company, you must be, or you should be asking the question, so what's in it for me? And we're going to try and answer that question as well. All right, let's jump straight into the first question. What's the fuss all about? Now, many of you, and even from this morning's opening speech, will know that there is increased and urgent realization that the planet cannot sustain our current level of human activity. So, you know, in terms of even this morning, the chief of UN has said that by the end of this decade, we were anticipated to have to halve our emissions in order to ensure that we remain below 1.5 degrees. But now, unfortunately, with the war going on at the moment, our emissions are anticipated to increase by 14%. And that, you know, if you look at the IPCC report, will definitely spell disaster for the planet. So without going into too much detail into the stats, it is anticipated that if we don't do anything at the moment, it will be catastrophic for the planet. And following, you know, selected pledges, we might have a chance at keeping temperatures below already elevated levels. And as Elon Musk would say, we're running the most dangerous experiment today to see how much carbon dioxide the atmosphere can handle before a catastrophe. Now, the second reason for the fuss is increased clarity on the inequity and suffering of humankind. Now, there is, you know, with our connectedness and with our access to information and data at the moment, we do globally have an increased clarity on, for example, levels of poverty. And unfortunately, with the tragedy of COVID, we did see the first rise in 20 years of extreme poverty in the world. In addition to that, something that actually is very close to home for Malaysia is the issue of modern slavery or forced labor. Now, in many of your organizations, you might or might not be looking at your labor practices, but if you do deal with a large number of workers, we do encourage that you look closely, because it does pose a business continuity issue, as we've seen in some companies in Malaysia as well, being banned by foreign countries. So at the moment, there is also rampant modern slavery around the world. And with this increased clarity, there is more focus on the suffering of humankind at the moment. The third reason for the fuss at the moment is the increased demand for ethical and transparent organizations. And the world basically sitting up and saying, you know, there is a very high level of corruption in the world in organizations across the many different sectors, and there has to be more transparency and disclosure in order for us to be able to deal with these levels of corruption. Now, interestingly enough, these three reasons for the fuss that you see in sustainability at the moment correlates very nicely with what we're here to talk about, which is basically the E, the S, and the G. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about definitions when we get to what is corporate sustainability later on in the overview, but suffice to say that these three reasons for the fuss actually correlate to the E, the environmental component, the S, the social component, and the G, the governance component. Now, this focus on ESG and this understanding that there has to be more transparency and more disclosure and more understanding of how the private sector plays into these three issues is a global recognition of the issues today. And you would have heard of the SDGs, for example, the Paris Agreement, COP26, which at the moment is being acknowledged that is not enough to bring us to where we need to be. And you might have heard of science-based targets, or SBTs, in an effort to bring companies to net zero. Now, as I go through this presentation, and later on, I'll be introducing even more to your alphabet soup in terms of different standards that are out there. Don't be worried if you don't understand every single one of them. That is not expected of you. We will talk about what is recommended for the local sector for Malaysia, what are the expected or the recommended standards that you do adopt. But every time you see a new terminology, I would encourage you, or a new standard, I would encourage you to just take note of it. And if you have a little bit of time, to basically just read up a little bit on the standards. But don't be worried if you keep hearing more and newer standards, because at the moment it is a relatively fragmented space in terms of standardization. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Now, I do want to caveat this with the fact that with all the companies here today and all the 200 participants here today, the why of sustainability and ESG might not resonate with all of you. At the moment, you might be facing different priorities. You might be struggling as a result of coming out of COVID. You might be trying to ensure that your bottom line still looks good. You might be looking at expansion into a different country. You might have a variety of different priorities. And this particular priority might not resonate with you at this point in time. But however, even if it doesn't resonate with you, you do need to know that it is coming your way, and that you do, to some extent, need to pay some attention to sustainability and ESG. And I'll tell you exactly why in this next question that we're going to address, right? So we're going to talk about, okay, now that we know high level macro why why this fuss is all about, who's actually looking out for it. And here I'd like to talk about 6 key stakeholders that you have that are definitely looking out for sustainability and ESG. So the first stakeholder that I'd like to talk about is governments around the world. Now, more and more, as even mentioned by Datuk Sri Zaini earlier today, governments around the world are looking at setting net zero pledges. And not only are they setting pledges, more and more of these are being proposed into policy and law documents as well. As a very clear indication of this, and the first mention of an implementable carbon border tax has actually been proposed within the EU. So look out for this. If Europe is one of your markets today, starting January 2026, EU importers and non-EU producers will be asked to disclose and report on their emissions in order to allow for this tax to actually begin operations in 2026. Reporting will start in 2023. Closer to home, for Malaysia, in our 12th Malaysia Plan, we do, as Malaysia, seek to be carbon neutral by 2050, with a few pledges that have been made, including no new coal-powered plants, for example, exploring carbon economic instruments like pricing and tax, and developing EV technology, as well as a coastal and marine blueprint as well. So keep in mind that governments around the world are in fact looking at companies and your level of emissions, and we'll bring that closer to home later when we talk about your emissions specifically. So the takeaway from this is, do take note that there are increasing business implications of a company's carbon footprint. Who else is looking out for it? Investors are definitely looking out for it. And for some of you, that might be the reason why you're here today. And we have been talking to a lot of companies whereby they are very interested in terms of what the investors are looking for, because more and more investors are in fact looking out for ESG disclosures. ESG assets are definitely on track to hit about 1/3 of global AUM. And Asia, even though we're starting from a lower base, so as you would know, investors in Europe and the US are much more sensitive to sustainability and ESG at the moment, but Asia is in fact growing faster than those two regions at the moment. There is a supporting graph that shows that ESG assets in fact are performing, especially in this environment today, slightly better than the average indexes. Closer to home, there's another terminology or standard that I'm introducing here, but there is a principle called UNPRI. You don't need to know the details behind UNPRI if you are a company, but what you do need to know is that these principles for responsible investment basically guide investors on how and what they need to be looking out for when they're talking to companies like yourselves. So when they become a signatory to UNPRI, and there are over 2,000 signatories around the world today, they do in fact need to report back to them on their portfolio companies, which might include yourselves. In Malaysia, there are 13 Malaysian signatories. At the last webinar we ran, there were 12, and I did a check. And in fact, that's increased by one now to 13. And each of these investors, including some of our largest institutional investors, are at the moment engaging with their portfolio of companies, including possibly yourselves, in order to understand your ESG performance and commitments so that they themselves can report back to this body called the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. The takeaway from this slide is that investors are increasingly screening and looking at non-financial performance alongside financial performance. So you're already very familiar with how your investors run due diligence and scrutinize your finances. And now it is beginning to take shape in the non-financial realm within your company in terms of how are you performing from an ESG perspective. The next set of stakeholders who are looking out for it, and this was mentioned earlier as well in the opening speech, are companies. Now, this is extremely important, and in fact, it could be one of the most important levers of all the 6 stakeholders that I'm talking about this morning. As mentioned earlier, 78% of multinational companies are planning to cut supplies by 2025 for impacting their carbon reduction goals. What does this mean for Malaysia? In the same report, and I would encourage you to have a look at it, it has identified the top countries whereby their annual export revenue is at risk. Now, to put this into context, at the moment, our export revenue is made up by many, many SMEs, including yourselves. And as you can see here, Malaysia is number 7 in the list of most impacted countries around the world in terms of our annual export revenue at risk. And this is just at risk from an ESG perspective. We're not talking about any of the other unexpected occurrences that might happen in the world. And as mentioned, as part of this annual export revenue would be partly your revenue within that if you do export to those markets. And racing against the clock to hit their own net zero carbon goals. So mind you, the multinational companies have set their own net zero goals. And as you'll see later on in the emissions conversation, when they talk about net zero carbon goals, when they do the calculations, when they actually look at what their own carbon footprint is, MNCs do, or rather all companies do need to look at their supply chains. So folks like yourselves might make up the supply chain of some of the MNCs. Now that means that you also make up the carbon footprint of those MNCs. And as they're trying to reduce their own carbon footprint, they do need to look up and down their supply chain and ensure that they are as low carbon as possible across their value chain, which is exactly the reason why they're looking to switch. Now, very practical examples we've seen on the ground as we ourselves, as Thoughts engage with companies. One of the companies that we recently kicked off a project with, one of the first questions they had during the kickoff meeting was, can we give them, and this is a Malaysian company, mid-cap, one of their first questions was, can we give them a list of suppliers that are low carbon? And our answer to that at the moment is we don't yet have a very solid list of suppliers, but we will look at developing that. And hopefully many of you will be amongst the lower carbon suppliers that we can recommend. Who else is looking out for it? So financial institutions are looking out for it. And by looking out for it, we mean in 2 ways. So one, in terms of screening. And in the screening, it could increase or decrease your chances of actually securing financing. But more exciting than that, there are actually benefits to having good ESG performance. Some of the banks, including the 3 that Bursa Malaysia has signed MOUs with, are at the moment exploring providing beneficial rates and other financing perks to companies that have proven to have good ESG performance. Talent, as some of you might know or might experience at the moment, there's huge competition for talent at the moment. And one of the things that the millennial pool of talent, which will make up a large part of the workforce if they haven't already, is that they actually do consider your position on issues with regards to climate change and social issues as they're looking at their choice of employers, including retention and recruitment as well. Consumers at the moment, according to stats, maybe Asia slightly less so, but more and more consumers are becoming a little bit more discerning. They are becoming a little bit more informed consumers in terms of being able to make informed decisions and buy from companies that have a lower carbon footprint. So in essence, those were the 6 stakeholders that we wanted to mention. Now, when we mention these stakeholders, and later on when I talk about regulations, oftentimes it seems a lot like there is a stick and play, and we might not talk as much about the carrot potentially, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But this is very similar to us seeing a calamity that's about to happen and ensuring that all the right pressures from all the different stakeholders are in fact in place to ensure that we're headed the right way and that we're encouraging companies like yourselves to embark on this journey to head the right way. Now, having said that, above and beyond the more macro and conceptual need at a planetary level, from a company perspective, I do want you to ask what's in it for you. And I'm not here to say that it's not a trade-off. I'm not here to say that it doesn't require investments. And in fact, it is a journey ahead of you. But what I would like to say is, as you take that journey, don't allow market forces to determine what your trajectory is. Don't allow market forces and all the different market forces that I've mentioned earlier, don't allow that to drag you in ways that you might not anticipate. So I would encourage you to understand this entire area of sustainability and ESG that's coming up, even if it's not extremely technical at the moment, but do begin that understanding journey so that you're able to make these decisions, very informed decisions, to know what it is that you need to do. And mind you, when we talk to companies, we have a whole range of companies, starting from companies that come to us and ask us, what is the minimum I must do in order to be compliant? And that's absolutely fine. To be very honest, whatever brings you to the table, if you are looking merely to be compliant at the moment, start there, and that's absolutely fine. We're quite convinced that as you start that journey and as you begin exploring what compliance looks like, you will begin to explore and find opportunities for yourself as well. And we have the range from there. We have a range all the way to companies that are not necessarily doing exceptionally well, but are extremely moved by the need to be able to be a positive impact on the planet and on society, and asking us, as a company, how do I ensure that I bring a positive impact whilst ensuring that I have a very positive bottom line. So as you ask what's in it for me, there are two key, there we go. There's actually a range of thoughts that you would need to put in place, all the way ranging from sustainability and ESG being a threat, all the way to it being an opportunity. And we've spoken a little bit about parts of that this morning as well. The three key value levers that you would seek as you begin to think about what it means for you. The first lever on the far left is where you ensure that you do know what the threats are, that you are assessing the risks of sustainability and ESG to your business. And we've just mentioned some of them this morning. And in a minute, I'll talk about the 5 risks that you do need to look out for. But it does ensure your ability to stay in business. And we've seen, as I mentioned, in many instances, whether it is labor practices or whether it is environmental impact, where companies have in fact had their business impacted by ESG as well. And also it does increase your ability to be competitive. The second lever that I would encourage you to look at is the lever of increasing profits. And this allows you to improve margins and allows you to improve market terms as well. And we'll talk about where specifically you might look in order to look for initiatives that from ESG and sustainability that might actually be able to increase your profits. And finally, the third lever, and the most exciting, to be honest, as you progress down this journey, you will begin to unlock growth opportunities. And in unlocking growth opportunities, it will allow for your ability to differentiate from the rest of the companies in your industry or in your market today. And it will increase your ability to innovate as well. All right, so let's take these relatively quickly, one by one. So in terms of reducing risks, there are 5 key risks that you do need to keep in mind, and I encourage you to explore these in more detail than how I'm actually going to be covering. So the first risk is about physical risks. So the most tangible risk to assets, and you would see that, very close to home example would be, as mentioned earlier, the unexpected and increasingly severe floods that we're facing as a country today. So physical risks include questions like, for example, the location of your factories. Will you be impacted by these extreme weather conditions, both here as well as if you have factories in other countries as well? Existential risk. Now, this is relatively selective by industry. So there are several sectors that actually face the risk of becoming stranded assets as well in terms of facing existential risks within their industry. So this includes the better known oil and gas industry, for example, of which the oil and gas industry is at the moment very quickly pivoting towards being energy companies as well as other areas like aviation and construction, where there are huge changes and innovations within those industries at the moment. The third risk, and this is very applicable to every single company here, are transitional risks. So what are the risks that are posed to your company as a result of the ESG practices of either yourselves or larger companies or the other stakeholders involved? So for example, in transportation, this shift to zero emissions vehicles, which is inevitable, how does that impact your company if you have a fleet, for example, and so on and so forth. These transitional risks are very well documented, so do have a look at your particular industry in terms of what transitional risks your industry is facing at the moment. Regulatory risk, we've spoken about this somewhat this morning as well. So even if companies do not at the moment voluntarily decarbonize or become much more environmentally and socially impact conscious, there will be regulations that will be coming down the way. And I do encourage companies to have a look at this, because you do not want to be caught unawares in a place where the regulation actually precedes some of your actions, which you can already anticipate today. And finally, reputational risk. We've seen many companies where for sustainability reasons, for fallouts that have been covered extensively in the media, you do face reputational risks as well within some of your consumers, or even within some of your larger B2B customers. So these are some of the risks that I would encourage you to, if you do have a risk register, if you do have risk indicators that you are monitoring on a monthly or quarterly basis, do include sustainability risk indicators within your risk register so that you are constantly also keeping an eye on those risks. Increasing profits. I'm going to talk a little bit faster for time at the moment. Increasing profits. The main space to look for the win-win situations, as we like to call them. So there would be within efficiencies. Now, efficiencies would form probably the lowest hanging fruit for your company, and maybe the one with the easiest and the lowest barrier to entry. Do look out for eco-efficiencies around energy, around water, around raw material use, for example. And if you are not already, and some of these aspects might already be built into your business. And do also look out for advantages as you improve and increase your ESG performance. Do look out for advantages in terms of cost capital, operational performance, or even your share price performance as well, which will result. Finally, in terms of the third value lever, unlocking growth opportunities, very much within your ability to differentiate. We've spoken this morning about suppliers that are able to present a very compelling sustainability case of why they should be a supplier of choice, especially in serving B2B markets in Asia and around the world today. And it has, in the same report that I mentioned earlier, it has been mentioned that MNCs are in fact at the moment willing to spend more on net zero products because they are facing those pressures. Now, we do know that in asking all of you to do what is needed in terms of ensuring your positive environmental and social impact, that you cannot be doing things the same way you've been doing, and therefore innovation as a result of sustainability has been proven to actually propel companies forward in terms of unlocking, for example, new target markets, new demographics, new products and services that might serve this new need that is currently in the market today. And I do encourage you to look deeper into that. So that, in essence, covers our first part of why sustainability is a must today. I'm going to move on to the next section, which is 3 things that every company needs to know about sustainability. And those 3 things are: what is corporate sustainability? What are the current regulations in Malaysia, making it very relevant? Some of it is relevant to listed entities. Some of it is relevant to all companies, including SMEs. But even if you're an SME that's not listed at the moment, do look out for those regulations, because it's just a matter of time before it impacts all companies as well. And also what guidance is available. Now, as promised, there will be 3 poll questions. This is the first of it. So do move in a little bit closer to your computer if you're not already, in order to be able to answer this poll question. This is a question, and I'm going to launch the poll at the minute so that we can actually read through the question together, and then I'll talk a little bit about it. You should see the poll questions at this point in time. The question is, what are some of your company's biggest obstacles in adopting sustainability today? And mind you, it's a multiple choice question, so select as many as is applicable. We don't see the need to, no board or senior management buy-in, no clear ownership of sustainability, benefits or returns are not obvious, high cost or investment received, you have the will, but you don't know the way, measurements or indicators are confusing, or you have no obstacles currently, which is excellent. I'll just give you about 60 seconds to answer this question because we don't have much time. But as you're answering, I do want to let you know that we've asked this exact question probably to about 200 companies in the last 1.5 years now. And it is fascinating in terms of how the answers have actually shifted to reflect market sentiment as well. And I'll talk about that as soon as the answers come in. 5 more seconds for you. 4, 3, 2, and just as I'm about to say 1, you know, there's a flood of answers coming in. Thank you very much. I'm going to end the poll now. And I will share the results. Okay, so as you can see, it's really interesting, and it follows the trend that I was talking about over the last 1.5 years. When we first began running this poll, many answers were actually top heavy, where there was, I either didn't see the need to, or there was no board or senior management buy-in. As we progressed over the last 1.5 years, we found the challenges or the needs pushing downwards in terms of really, it's no longer a question of why, but really a question of how, which is why I want to move relatively quickly through this so that we can get to the how in a moment. All right. So what is corporate sustainability? There are many definitions out there. Very quickly, the definition that we like the best is that sustainability is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generation to meet theirs. And that's why amongst your board and your CEOs and the way they personally feel about sustainability or ESG sometimes is also quite influenced by the younger generation as well it should be, because it will greatly impact them. And it encompasses your ability to sustain and your capacity to endure as a company. And that is why I can't stress enough that sustainability is not just about environmental and social impact. It's about achieving positive environmental and social impact whilst ensuring that your company thrives in the process as well. And alongside that, you're achieving very positive environmental and social impact. And I know that almost sounds occasionally like a conundrum, and this is why this journey hopefully will ensure that it's not. Now, getting slightly, this is something that I really want to demystify and just broadly defining sustainability. Sustainability is largely defined into 4 broad categories, okay? Not 3, 4. And it's economic, environmental, social, and governance. And this forms the acronym EESG, which is a little bit different from the ESG acronym that we've been talking about. And I'll show you exactly why. So in these four categories, economic obviously deals with your economic sustainability. Environmental, social, and governance are relatively straightforward and self-explanatory. The terminology that you'll see in the market, you will see the term EES. And in fact, EES is a term that's also used by Bursa Malaysia for companies that are being guided by their sustainability reporting guideline. And EES basically talks about, it is an acronym of the first 3 categories: economic, environmental, and social. But that doesn't mean that governance is not important. Most of the times when you see EES, in also global standards, when you see the term EES, governance is typically included in the first E, in the economic pillar. And this is also known in layman terms as the triple bottom line, or profit, planet, and people. All right, there is the much more commonly used term in the investor realm called ESG. And ESG covers specifically, as we said earlier, the 3 categories of environmental, social, and governance. The reason it covers ESG, not including the first economic category, is because in the investor world, when they talk about ESG, it covers non-financial disclosures. And the reason for that is because financial disclosures are already well-baked. You know that you do go through the due diligence of the investors, and they're very familiar with your financials, and in fact are tracking your financial performance possibly closer than many other stakeholders out there. So you will have your ESG or your non-financial disclosures sitting alongside your financial disclosures. There are efforts at the moment to combine the financial and non-financial disclosures to ensure that disclosures take a more general terminology and that companies are judged more generally than just the financial or the non-financial disclosures. Now, at a macro level, because we won't have time to go into very detailed descriptions or definitions of companies, there are, in essence, 5 stages of progression of a company down the sustainability journey, and it's called the sustainability wave. And what I would encourage you to do as I'm describing each wave very quickly is for you to personally place your own company on this journey of 5 stages to see where you are, but above and beyond that, see where you want to get to. So when you see where you are and where you want to get to, you're almost setting yourself a goal. And then you think about how fast you want to get there. And that will build up your roadmap from getting from one stage to the next. So stage one are pre-compliance companies, where companies are not even in compliance with sustainability and ESG. You can then move on to the compliance stage, where you are doing the minimum necessary in order to be compliant with the different regulations that you're being subject to. You then move on to being beyond compliance. Ideally, you move on to having sustainability being more integrated into your company strategy, because you now see the value of actually heading down the sustainability journey alongside the rest of the world as well. And very few companies do actually reach the stage where sustainability or the environmental and social impact of their company actually forms the purpose and passion of the company. And oftentimes companies that do fall into that category, even globally, were actually built on that purpose and passion. Moving on to the second question under what is sustainability is, what are the current regulations in Malaysia? And here, as mentioned, some of it impacts listed companies, some of it actually impacts companies as a whole, but I do encourage you to look at the regulations, because they will become more all-encompassing over time. So Bursa Malaysia has implemented mandatory sustainability reporting for listed companies, and this is applicable to all listed companies under the main and ACE markets, and this is where close scrutiny is required to ensure that you do know what it is that is being required from you under the listing requirements. The second regulation, or evaluation rather, that's extremely interesting is FTSE for Good, which has gained a little bit more popularity in the last 2 years, ever since the results the ranking of the results have been made public. There has been more focus on FTSE Malaysia for Good, and I'll talk about what that particular standard is in a minute. But what Bursa Malaysia has done is, back in 2014, they've actually enlisted with, this is FTSE from FTSE Russell, they have an ESG screen called FTSE for Good. And at the moment, 270 companies are being evaluated from our stock exchange, of which, if they reach a certain scoring, they actually make it onto, if they reach 2.9, they actually make it onto a benchmark index. And at the moment, there are 80 companies on this benchmark index. And the reason is important, as we said, as investors begin to adopt ESG screenings, they do look at these indices where the screening's already been done for them. Securities Commission themselves have actually released the SRI roadmap for the financial sector, but as we know, the financial sector impacts every single one of you. And there are very solid recommendations and strategies within this roadmap that would encourage the financial sector to actually head more and more towards sustainable and responsible investing as well. For those of you that are also being regulated under Securities Commission MCCG, the recent April 2021 update actually includes sustainability accountability at board level. So I would encourage you to look at that. And of course, MACC Section 17A with the Act on Anti-Corruption. So as you can see, there are numerous different regulations that might not even have the terminology sustainability within it, but we do encourage you to look at all of this relatively holistically, in knowing that we're all headed towards this common goal of ensuring that sustainability and ESG is being very much better regulated, because of the fact that, as we mentioned before, there are different pressures that you are facing in ensuring that you are heading down this journey. Now, last question before we get to the how is in terms of what guidance is available out there. Now, in terms of guidance, don't get overwhelmed by this slide, because I'm going to throw a bunch of alphabets at you in a moment. But generally, guidance is available in the form of frameworks, global frameworks. And I'll anticipate a question before it's being asked. We're often asked, if I am a smaller company, if I'm an SME, should I still look at global standards? Is it applicable to me? It seems very overwhelming. It seems very complex. Do I actually need to? And our response typically is that global standards, if you break it down, right? And unfortunately, we don't have time to break down something like GRI at the moment, but if you break down the global standards, they are not as complex as you might think they are. So for example, if you get a standard that has 200 indicators, for example, you are not expected to actually be able to comply with all 200 indicators or have data for all of it or report upon all of the 200 indicators. But even as an SME, if you start with 2 or 3 indicators, 4 or 5 indicators, next year, 6 or 7 indicators, you are slowly and progressively employing a global standard and you're beginning to learn the terminology. And I'll give you examples of indicators that I am confident you already have. So global standards ask questions like, for example, what is the diversity in your company? What is the gender breakdown? How many men, how many women? How many training hours do you have for your employees? What is your energy consumption? So questions, and I'm giving very general indicators that will be applicable to every sector, but it's very general data points that you already have and you're probably already openly disclosing, but you're not aware that you are being guided by these global standards as well. Speaking of global standards, typically they fall under 2 buckets of frameworks. The first framework is reporting frameworks. So reporting frameworks will guide you on how and what to report. So most of them are nonprofit organizations, and they will typically guide you and show you, this is the indicator, this is what's required from that indicator for you to report in order for you to be guided to be more transparent. Don't worry if you don't recognize all of these terminologies. They are, for example, GRI, SASB, TCFD, SBTs helps you set targets, and of course, the Carbon Disclosure Project. In Malaysia, if you had to pick one at the moment to get started, we would encourage you to go with GRI, which is also recommended by Bursa, the Global Reporting Initiative. And if you look into the Global Reporting Initiative, it is relatively easy to follow. It's got specific topics that might actually sound like your material matters, and it's broken down by topics into different indicators as well. A fast up and coming standard, if you want to look at after GRI, the next one would be TCFD, which is also recommended by Bursa Malaysia. The second bucket of frameworks are evaluation frameworks. So now that you have reporting frameworks to guide you how and what to report, you now have evaluation frameworks, frameworks that judge you, basically frameworks that look at what you've disclosed and give you and score you in terms of how well you're doing. And they give you a rating, and sometimes they give you a ranking as well. So some of the evaluation frameworks out there include frameworks like FTSE4Good, Dow Jones Sustainability Index, MSCI, the largest one in the world, Sustainalytics, and so on and so forth. You can see most of these are affiliated with the stock exchanges as well. And it's not just their own stock exchange, but you have other stock exchanges that actually subscribe to their screening in order to screen their own companies. For example, Bursa Malaysia subscribes to FTSE4Good and has FTSE4Good provide the service of screening our listed companies to evaluate how well they're doing from an ESG perspective. So all 270 companies that I mentioned earlier, they all get a number, a score. In fact, they get more than one number. Their score is broken down specifically into how they're performing in ESG, how they're performing by each theme within E, within S, and within G, so that that too can help them improve on the journey as well. Now, what other guidance is available, right? That's some guidance. And one of the things I really like is Warren Buffett's quote when he says, when people tell me they've learned from experience, I tell them the trick is to learn from other people's experience. So I'm just going to give you a few examples and case studies here. And mind you, when I give you the case studies, it's just to get you thinking, but some of the easiest ways is to think of, folks in your industry, whether they're your peer or your competitor, pick up their sustainability report, look at their website, see what they're doing in terms of sustainability, and learn from there as well. Or there might be other people picking up your report and learning from you as well. The first quick case study, and I won't be able to give it enough time, is a company, if you can look it up, it's become a case study for many business schools as well, is a company called Desso. They were a carpet company on the verge of bankruptcy, and at the moment it is one of the most successful carpet companies because on that verge of bankruptcy, they decided that they had nothing to lose and they adopted a cradle-to-cradle concept, which is a circular economy concept, across their entire company. And basically that was in fact their redeeming factor at that point in time and their turnaround. And I'll run a short video right now just to showcase a little bit of what they've done. And as their CEO says, waste is food for new products.
Millions of square meters of worn-out carpet are thrown away every year, often being dumped at landfill sites. Early 2008, Desso, a leading manufacturer of high-quality carpet tiles and broadloom, took revolutionary steps to ensure that carpets can be safely recycled. Inspired by nature's continuous cycle, Desso bears the true identity of the cradle-to-cradle philosophy. Desso offers clients a take-back program to ensure that products will be recycled according to the cradle-to-cradle principles. Products will be taken back by Desso after their useful life and will be safely recycled into new carpet products or used in other recycling initiatives. Besides its own products, Desso also encourages international collection of all types of used carpet, except for carpet containing PVC. These carpet products are recycled using Desso's innovative separation technique called Refinity. This makes it possible to separate the carpet fibers from the backing, producing two material streams which can each be recycled. The carpet fibers are returned to the yarn manufacturer for production of new yarn. For polyamide 6 yarn, this process takes place at Aquafil, one of Desso's yarn suppliers. Aquafil has developed a proprietary technology at its regeneration plant to turn recovered post-consumer polyamide 6 carpet fibers into polyamide 6 again and again. And today's bitumen backing is used in the road and roofing industry. Fractions from felt-backed tiles are currently being used as secondary fuel, for instance, in the cement industry. Cradle-to-cradle design is inspired by nature and sees carpet as being made up of nutrients that should consistently remain in use in an unending cycle.
Part of the reason I like running that case study is really to highlight the companies like yourselves, as you are, whether you're providing services or products to your customers, as you're looking at your business processes, note that sustainability, as illustrated here, is not a side project. It is not purely a side project for, turning off the lights, for example. I know I'm being flippant about it, but truly begin looking at it as part of what part of your business process can you actually possibly innovate in order to be more sustainable, but at the same time be able to also improve your business operations. Some of it might require mid to longer term investments, and some of it are very short term, quick return projects, but have that business case in mind as you're looking at your company. Some other case studies, I'm not going to go through them from a time perspective as well. For example, there is a company called Yukos who was extremely skeptical. They're a stationery and business supplies company, and they realized that they could actually differentiate themselves as a sustainable supplier because that wasn't at that point in time being picked up within their industry, and they became one of the most sustainable suppliers in their industry, which, as we said before, makes them quite sought after at the moment. There's another interesting case study. This is a logistics company called Rainbow Freight Group. And what they did was they they initiated a night freight service, and this was purely to increase productivity of their fleet, and they found that it brought unanticipated advantages as well from an environmental perspective, as well as the appeal of the business model to some customers. Closer to home, we have examples. For example, one of our companies called in Malaysia, one of the companies in Malaysia called WCT, who have, for example, innovated an asphalt reuse technology to actually deal with waste management, as well as a name that we're quite familiar with, for example, MyNews, that has initiated a few different business processes, but something as simple as, for example, asking their customers if they indeed did need the credit card paper slip, actually did reduce their paper wastage and their paper costs as well. So just some very specific examples to showcase that, in fact, you can find little examples to begin building up this sustainability case study. And as you begin this adoption, ideally have this bigger picture in mind. Speaking of that, I'm going to spend about 15 to 20 minutes talking about 8 simple steps in adopting sustainability. And then I'll hand over to Tobias to actually talk about GHG emissions specifically. So taking a breather and moving on from the why and the what into the how at the moment. Now, keep in mind, I'm going to talk about 8 steps. And as I talk about 8 steps, what I would encourage you to do is either on your computers or paper and pen, try to begin taking notes on very actionable items that you could do today in order to begin your sustainability journey. As mentioned, the 8 steps, you could have an entry point into any of the 8 steps. And as you see them later on, I'll talk about where potentially your company might be entering the 8 steps. Okay, I'm going to dive in. I'm going to try and cover this in the next 15 to 20 minutes. If you have any questions, please do remember to type it in the Q&A. Before I launch into this charade of 8 steps, one of the things I really want to do, and this is extremely important, is to really think about, because we have limited time as mentioned, where in the 8 steps would you like me to focus on? And this is where I'm going to run the second poll question. So this poll question has nothing to do with market sentiments. It has everything to do with what you want to see from the next 15 to 20 minutes. So the question is, what would you be most interested in hearing about in this section? 1, how to get started in sustainability. 2, how to strategize and plan your sustainability efforts. How to measure and track, or how to report. 60 seconds for you to choose, so that we can talk more about what you're interested in. All right, 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. And the results are in. We're going to be talking mostly about strategizing, my favorite topic. So most of you want to know how to strategize and plan your sustainability efforts, which is excellent. Next, measure and track is very close behind. I understand the confusion that must happen in being able to track your progress. And that's followed by how to get started and how to report, two also equally important topics. So I'll try and focus my time based on that breakdown. But again, any questions in the chat? All right, so jumping into the 8 steps. The 8 steps are broken down into 4 simple phases, okay? And the 4 phases are know, plan, do, and tell. All right, I'm going to talk about each of those now specifically. So the first phase is know. So in the knowing, if you think about, regardless of where you are in your company at the moment, know has a few different levels of knowing, okay? So there are 2 steps within know. The first step is creating the awareness and the understanding in your company. in creating the awareness and understanding your company. I'll talk in a little bit more detail. I have one slide for each of these different phases. So I will talk in more detail for each of them. But awareness is basically building that understanding more deeply within the immediate team that is involved with sustainability, and your board and your top management, and potentially sustainability champions across the company, and maybe a little bit less deeply across every single employee in your company. Depending on the size of your company, you could have different levels of knowledge within the company of sustainability at any one point in time, and that's absolutely fine. The second step is about setting up. So what do you need to do for those of you that were wondering how to even begin your sustainability journey? We'll talk in a minute in more detail about setting up, but basically setting up is about knowing everything that's going on in your company and being able to set up a governance structure so that it gets enough and relevant focus in your company. The next phase is the plan phase, and this is the one you wanted me to spend a bit more time on, which I will in the more detailed slides. So the two steps within planning. So now that you know you need to plan, and in your planning, you will be looking at your sustainability strategy. What goals are you shooting for? What are the different pillars that are important? And alongside that, to support that, what are the actions that you need to take? How does your materiality assessment look? Who are the stakeholders that are involved? What are they thinking about your sustainability efforts as well? So all that comes in the planning phase. The third phase is about the doing. And in the doing, it is truly about the measuring, the indicators, the dashboards, the tracking of your progress of all the initiatives that you had identified in the planning phase that will bring you a little bit closer to where you want to be from a sustainability aspiration perspective. How do you now measure and track that? And finally, once you know and you've planned and you've done, is truly the telling. And in the telling, we break that down into reporting. And the reason these standards are important in the reporting is because you want to ensure that you are understood in the market. And there are basic terminologies, the same way your financial disclosures have very basic and very common terminologies. Like, you know, if you're not following global standards and you're not reporting on your EBITDA, for example, those are terminologies that are very specific to actually be able to help you be understood across different stakeholders. Similarly, in the non-financial disclosure side, you have terminologies that you can use to actually increase the understanding of, for example, investors in what you are doing and what you are achieving from a sustainability perspective in your company. And that ideally will spill over into storytelling as well, where this encompasses your internal comms, your external comms, even through your campaigns, and in fact, making up your brand persona and your brand story, if that's the way you want to go. If you want to be known as a sustainable company, you need to begin to be able to take action in that direction, but also emulate some of the actions that you're actually promoting. All right, so taking those in a little bit more detail in the next 5 to 10 minutes, these 4 phases: know, plan, do, and tell. And it is critical to basically understand and set up sustainability well. So what are some of the tips of what you can do within the know phase? All right, as you're looking to increase the level of awareness, whether it's a specific small group or across your company, we would encourage you first and foremost, seek a sufficient level of understanding for your board of directors, your top management team, and your sustainability working team. So first and foremost, and sufficient at this point will grow as your understanding grows, right? Alongside that, communicate this across your organization, at least a basic level of awareness and understanding, because you are now embarking on this journey and you'd like the rest of your organization to actually be on this journey with you, because actually you need everyone from across all departments in order to be able to contribute towards this effort. It is not an effort that can be run by 3 people sitting in an office for the rest of the company. Set up your sustainability governance structure. So it could possibly look something like this, where you have a steering committee, you have a working group, and we always encourage you to have a project management office, or if you have a dedicated sustainability team, that's great. If you're an SME that doesn't have a dedicated sustainability team, that is also fine, but you do need at least a percentage, even if it's 50% of 2 different people, or 30% of 6 people, you do need dedicated time for sustainability in terms of the to carry out all these different phases within your company. This is extremely important, conducting a baseline, and we encourage even companies that have done this for a number of years. What we found when we come in is sometimes there is insufficient understanding of what is going on across your company. As mentioned earlier on, there could be sustainability initiatives that don't come with this newfangled fancy labeling, and that's absolutely fine. Sometimes they are decades-old practices that increase productivity, for example, that actually does form part of your sustainability initiative. So what we would encourage is set up a very simple questionnaire or survey across your company. Ask every single department, either a rep within the department, to fill in those questionnaires, asking very guided questions like, are you running sustainability initiatives, or are you running specific initiatives that could actually contribute towards sustainability, and frame the question to your company processes as well. But conduct this baseline, gather the data, and you'll be very surprised oftentimes what you find is already going on across your company that contributes to sustainability. So again, I hope you have that pen and paper to actually take down potentially some actions that you could be taking in your company today. Next phase, planning. Something you wanted me to spend time on, so I will a little bit. So determine your sustainability aspirations. So earlier we spoke about the sustainability wave. Together with your board of directors and your top management, determine where you want to get to from a stage perspective. And oftentimes this talks to your willingness as a company and as leaders in your company, as well as oftentimes the ability of the company as well. Determine how fast you want to achieve that aspiration. So you could either take a big bang approach where you say, I really want to be able to integrate this into my strategy within the next 2 years or within the next 1 year. And so you take on a very proactive and aspirational tone in the company, and you ensure that the company moves that way. Or you could take a phased approach and say, I want to move along, possibly alongside my company strategy in the next 3 to 5 years, this is where I want to be. Or for some companies, if you want to take the emergent approach, where, as I said, some companies are saying, I want to stay in pace with the market, but I'm not necessarily looking to lead the market from a sustainability perspective. However, for those companies, I do encourage you to make that decision consciously, but also know that your competitors in your industry might not have the same approach. They might actually be aggressively adopting sustainability, and you could potentially be be on the shorter end of that stick. So do take a conscious approach. And again, that approach is unique to your company. Your situation is unique to your company. So, but make that decision so that decision is not made for you. From that decision, do build a sustainability strategy. Even if you're looking to take the emergent approach and you're trying to stay in pace with the rest of the market, you do need to know what that means. What does that mean? Where is the market going? And even if I want to take it slow, I do need to take these steps. So build the sustainability strategy. Ideally, have a framework in place that basically pulls together all your different focus pillars and your material matters, and plot this on a roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years with associated targets alongside. In order to be able to get where I want to be in 3 to 5 years, what are the targets and how are they broken down as milestones along the way? Assess your materiality. And this is It's a process, and it's not as complex as you might think, but it is still a process. And what we would, the assessing your materiality, basically there are two components to it. One part is determining the list of material. Now, when I say material matters, it is an ESG sustainability terminology, but basically what it simply means is what are the ESG elements or issues that are important to your business today, where your business can impact those ESG elements, and or those ESG elements will actually impact your business. So what are the important business issues with an ESG lens? And to assess that, you would need input from your board and senior management, which makes up the x-axis, and input from your stakeholders, both internal and external, typically in the form of a survey, a simple survey that basically rates the importance of your material matters. And that gives you the XY coordinate to actually plot on a materiality matrix. And that will help you determine what the important business issues are that actually rise up on the top right-hand corner. And of course, very important, plan your stakeholder engagement. How will you begin to infuse sustainability in your conversations and your dealings with your stakeholders? This could either be positioning sustainability with your internal stakeholders, your employees. It could be positioning sustainability with your customers. In fact, we've spoken to some companies, for example, that have now instituted policies. So for example, if you are in the furniture business and you have policies around certain chemicals that you would not use within your processes from a sustainability perspective, and they're beginning to communicate that to their customers as a differentiator as well, because obviously furniture touches every part of our lives. Or it could be engagement with your suppliers, because oftentimes besides the fact that your scope 3 is very much, and later on when we talk about emissions, is very much made up of your supply chain. Also, when you're looking to implement processes or improvements within your own business process, you would need your suppliers to be on board. So in the little video that we saw earlier in the case study, you'll see that they have to involve their suppliers in ensuring that they too are evolving to enable their sustainability actions in their own company. So I do encourage you to plan ahead, and it could be very, very simple to start off with, and you build upon that in the years to come. The other area that got a lot of interest from you in the poll earlier is in the do. This is in the tracking and the implementation. How do you measure? That is a very important question. And I'm happy to say that there's some guidance. So in terms of, I did promise that we would make recommendations specifically amongst all the many, many standards. So the first thing I would say is, do align your company to the SDGs. The SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, form actually the true north of every sector. And even though at the moment they're only projected to 2030, and even though as a global population we're not on track to achieve these goals at the moment for 2030, they still do form a very important true north for the rest of the world, and in terms of all the different sectors. So I do encourage you to align your actions and your strategy with the 17 goals in the SDGs. If you do want to look at the 17 goals in a little bit more detail, there are 169 targets alongside that. However, when you look at indicators, rather than looking at the indicators here, I would encourage you to look at the indicators in GRI. So here, the general guidance is to select a reporting framework as a guide. Remember the many, many frameworks that I mentioned on the left-hand side just now, the bucket, where it says reporting framework. However, for Malaysia, and in fact for the rest of the world, it is the most popular in the world at the moment. we would encourage you to adopt the GRI standards. This is also evolving. In about a year and a half, there will be significant changes. But at the moment, the GRI standards is broken down into very easy to understand topics. And I would encourage you to look at that. It's already broken down into E, environmental, S, social, and G, governance, which is in the first pillar, E. So the first pillar is economic, which includes economic as well as governance components. The second pillar is environmental. And the third one, with 19 different topics, is actually under social. This does not mean that you have to pick up every single topic, but pick the ones that match your material matters. And in fact, as a reporting framework, they do not expect you to cover every single topic in the framework. And if applicable, do look at an evaluation framework, because those also give you specific indicators and measurements. We don't have time today to talk about, for example, GRI 402-1, but that's how specific those indicators are. And for every indicator line item, even if it says, disclose the gender breakdown of your workforce, it will give you a page of guidance in terms of what are the numbers you need to show, how many years tracking, et cetera, et cetera. So I do encourage you to look and research the details of those if that's where you're headed. That gives you a good idea of the indicators. They're already giving you indicators to measure. And finally, and I'll close this off in a minute or two, is in the reporting and storytelling. And this is extremely important. And if you do adopt those standards from earlier, it does guide you in terms of reporting. Build your sustainability report, and it can be phased to be compliant. So in other words, your report is merely compliant. It can be fundamentally good, where it is an averagely good report, or you could build a market-leading sustainability report. Again, we're almost phasing this according to that strategy and roadmap that I spoke about earlier. And you can set very progressive aspirational goals, but start somewhere, right? So compliant, what are the key elements you need to include to ensure that your report complies? What are the basic building blocks to make it fundamentally good? And how do you ingrain sustainability into core company strategy? I'm so encouraged that many of you are looking at this from the poll earlier to make your report a leading report as well. And as you begin to ingrain sustainability into your brand story, and there's something that you might want to build a brand persona around sustainability for your company, keep it simple. Definitely communicate your purpose, build this into your corporate personality, connect with your customers, and get other people to tell your story. Because once you become a case study like Deso, other people like myself begin to talk about your company as well. So with that, I'm going to take a breath right now. And I was trying to cover just as much material as I possibly could. And here I'd like to hand over in a minute after the polls to Tobias to introduce himself. Please welcome Mr. Tobias Mangelman, and he will be bringing you through step-by-step guidance on calculating your GHG emissions. Tobias, over to you to run this poll.
Yes, thank you, Margie. And before we go into the session, like Margie, I would like to just quickly take stock. How comfortable are you with greenhouse gas emissions, that we can focus it a bit? Do you feel like a beginner? You don't really fully understand yet why and what the fuss is all about? Are you more advanced? You understand the global need to reduce emissions, but don't know how to start for your company? Are you proficient? You know how your company should calculate greenhouse gas emissions. You know what scope 1, 2, 3 is, or you're basically an expert already and you have your carbon footprint done. I hope, Margie, you can see whether we have enough votes in to get a quick read how experienced our audience is already.
Yeah, we are. And I must say, as it's coming in, thank you all. The participation has been great, even across the last 2 questions. So please keep it coming, because this is truly for you, and it's going to affect how Tobias will address the question in the next 20 minutes. All right, 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Ending the poll.
Okay, clear. So then 2/3 still see themselves as beginners. So then we will also handle a few of the basics. That's actually I cannot share. Can you please allow me to share again?
All right.
Oh, sorry.
There we go. Over to you, Tobias. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so as we just found out, many of you see yourself still as a beginner in this journey. So as a result, maybe let's spend also a few minutes on the basics first, right? And the two basics is we need to understand what exactly are greenhouse gases. I think for Margie, we understand why we need to reduce them. And we also need to understand how companies typically structure their greenhouse gas inventories when they look at it. And firstly, let's look at what are greenhouse gases. Often we talk about greenhouse gases, climate change gases, carbon footprint, etc. But ultimately it covers 6-7 gases. The most dominant one, the most known one, CO2, carbon dioxide. And often we use that as a reference point, but there are also other gases, right? There are methane. If you're in the agricultural sector or waste management, you might have methane. There are also nitrous oxides, which is used again from comes from fertilizers. And there are gases that come from cooling supply chains. But for all practical purposes, most of you, the relevant greenhouse gas that your company will produce is CO2. And for the other gases, don't worry too much. If you use a standard calculator or tool, this tool typically translates all the other gases into CO2 equivalent, CO2e. So there are global warming potentials that say, oh, methane is more than 20 times more powerful than CO2, etc. But for most practical purposes, you don't have to worry too much. Most of these tools, the little calculators, they can translate the numbers into CO2e equivalent, CO2 equivalent, and that's how you often report your greenhouse gases. So now that we know what exactly the relevant gases are, let's focus how you as a company typically would think about your greenhouse gas inventories, and also how most reporting standards, or all of them by now, will ask you to think about it. And in general, I mean, you know your company, right? You have your reporting company core operations. You have some upstream activities because you get products, raw materials supplied to you. You sell then your finalized products downstream to your customers. And that's how this whole supply chain view comes in, right? You are just one part within this supply chain, and your company has a certain contribution to the greenhouse gas inventory. And typically, we look into 3 scopes for each company. The first scope is really your direct emissions, and we talk about it a little bit more in detail, but it's really the emissions that your company generates from stationary combustion, from mobile combustion, from vehicles, etc. That's scope 1, and we cover it a bit more in detail. Second scope, or scope 2, is the emissions that you buy. It's indirect emissions. You buy them basically by buying electricity or steam or cool air from Tenaga or a different utility provider. So it's basically emissions that you buy into your company by using energy sources like electricity from Tenaga. And the third scope, which is actually the most complicated one, but actually also, as Margie mentioned earlier on, from the Standard Chartered report, one of the most important ones because of the supply chain emissions, it's a scope 3, emissions that you buy in, that you indirectly buy in because you buy raw materials, because you buy equipment, because you buy capital goods, because these raw materials are delivered to you, they're transported to you. And then afterwards, when you ship out your goods, there are scope 3 emissions because you transport your goods to the customer uses his goods. These goods are basically at the end of life in some shape or form discarded. So that is scope 1, 2, 3, and we'll cover them in more detail, but it's very, very important that you get your head around them. And it's not, for scope 1 and 2, it's actually quite simple. It's not complicated at all. So you can literally, if you have an Excel spreadsheet open, nearly start calculating them already. Scope 1, as I said, it's emissions that are a direct result from sources that are owned or controlled by the company because you burn some fuel, right? So either you have an own electricity generator, or you have a boiler, or you have a heat and power plant where you produce steam and electricity. So within your facilities, you burn materials. Applies to some manufacturing sectors. Or secondly, you have a physical or chemical process that releases emissions. For example, if you produce cement, the inherent chemical reaction of cement releases CO2. It's a chemically given formula, easy to calculate, but out of the cement production comes CO2, not only from the combustion, also from the chemical reaction. Or if you process waste. Depending on how you process it, you will produce methane, right? But it's basically emissions that are generated by the process. It can also be transportation of materials, products, and waste or employees in your compound. So we're not talking about employee travel, right? We're talking on your compound. You have a forklift, you have a truck, you have an excavator, you have other mobile equipment that is being used to transport things around. And they are also part of scope 1. And you might have fugitive emissions, especially if you process, if you have cooling processes. So if you have cooling processes, refrigeration, you would need to look into more detail, because even though it's very small amounts of fugitive emissions that come out of there, the global warming potential of these gases is very, very high, much higher than CO2. So if you have cooling processes, you need to look into them and understand what are the fugitive emissions. But I think for most of you, it's really about either you have a process where you burn something, or you have a chemical process and a few forklifts driving around. Scope 1. Scope 2 means you buy in these emissions, indirect emissions resulting from you purchasing energy products, mainly electricity, steam, heat, or cold air. And so electricity is fairly easy, right? In Malaysia, we have 3 options. If you are in Peninsula, you probably buy it from Tenaga. If you are in Sarawak, it's Sarawak Energy. In Sabah, Sabah Electricity Board, right? So those are your 3 sources of electricity. If you don't produce it yourself, then you would have covered in scope 1 already. In some rare cases, you might also buy heat or cool air. I mean, Tenaga, for some buildings, operates a central cooling plant. Petronas operates a few district cooling plants. So in some cases, you might actually buy hot or cold air from a third party. And then you would need to account for these emissions as scope 2. So far, so simple, quite easy, or quite overseeable. The real complexity comes in with scope 3. But as Margie, as the Capital Market Malaysia mentioned, that's really where we need to put a lot of attention, because if a large part of our emissions comes from scope 3, then we cannot ignore them, right? If I bake a bread, right, and I buy flour, sugar, eggs, oil, and the package plastic in it, then I need to understand how do all these ingredients actually add to the carbon footprint of my loaf of bread, right? So I need to look into the upstream emissions. I need to understand, okay, what are the materials that I buy? Is it egg? Is it flour? Is it sugar? What is the embedded greenhouse gas footprint of those? But I also need to think about capital goods, right? If I'm a construction company and have a crane and an excavator and a digger and a bulldozer, what is the pure carbon that is embedded in this machine without even using it, right? Just, I mean, they're heavy machinery. To build them has taken quite a bit of CO2. And I also need to think about upstream transportation. How do the products come to me, etc. And on the downstream side, it's really if I bring my products to market, right? What are the emissions that I generate there? And if I take my bread example again, every morning you see branded trucks driving through Kuala Lumpur and Selangor and other parts of Malaysia with a bread brand name on it. This truck is needed to bring the bread to the 7-Eleven, to the Speed Mart, etc. So that is the emissions that you cause by bringing the product to the market, right? And if you don't transport bread, but ice cubes, tube ice, or any frozen or cooled kind of product, then the emissions of the transport of bringing it to market are even higher. So you need to look into that. And the most tricky one, we'll discuss it afterwards one more time, is also you should even think about the emissions of the use of your sold product. And that is more important, for example, for electrical items. But if you sell a fridge, then your customer will cause emissions by using the fridge. If you sell an energy efficient fridge that uses less electricity, your customer, the use of the product will create less emissions. If you sell very inefficient equipment, then it will have more emissions. So these emissions of the use of the sold product become your company's scope 3 emissions. So let me pause there once. Those were the 2 important first questions. Understand what are the greenhouse gas emissions and the different types, and how do I think about them for a company by scope 1, 2, and 3. And as we promised at the very beginning, we will provide you again a very simple 6-step process how to go about determining your greenhouse gas emissions. And it's really, I mean, we are throwing around a lot of abbreviations, and it might seem a bit daunting, but it's actually in many cases not so difficult. So starting with step one, before you start calculating, before you open the Excel file, we still need to say, what are our emission boundaries, right? Because sometimes it's quite easy. Sometimes it's just one company and it's just me and 10 employees, and that's easy. But sometimes, you know, we have a few subcontractors or we have a joint venture company, etc. And you need to just define where is the boundary, right? Is it just this company or also joint venture company? And typically we always say, let's define the boundaries by operational control. If I control the subcontractor or if I control the joint venture, then I account for it. Otherwise, the other person accounts for it, and the products he gives to me is third-party Scope 3 emissions. So firstly, design the boundaries. Can be very simple. In some cases, can be a bit more complex if you have a big conglomerate of companies. Once you know the boundaries, we need to look into the different emission sources. And we have already talked about it. Scope 1, we explained, stationary mobile combustion. Scope 2, consumption of purchased electricity, and Scope 3. So we know what are the different emission sources. We have a rough idea also upstream, where is our upstream emissions coming from, downstream, where are they coming from? And we structure it by these categories. Now, the really hard work comes now to collect the activity data, because we know what are the Scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, but now we need to start collecting data to compile it, to calculate it. And for some of the Scope 1 emissions, it might be super easy, right? If I have a boiler that I fire with LPG or diesel or gas, right, I might have a fuel monitoring system, or I have a monthly invoice for the amount of gas or LPG that I buy, right? So I'm probably within my accounting system, I already have some system in place to track actually how much fuel do I buy in liters or kilograms or whatever. If I have a lot of emissions from mobile consumption, because I have a large fleet of vehicles in my operations, trucks, forklifts, bobcats, right? Again, I probably have a fuel monitoring system. I know already how many liters of diesel do I need every month or every week or every year. So getting this kind of data, except for the fugitive emissions, is probably quite easy, because within your accounting team, you already account for it. And for Scope 2, it can be even easier, because if you only buy now electricity from one of the Malaysian utilities in Peninsular Malaysia, Sarawak or Sabah, all you really need to do is get the amount of kilowatt hours or megawatt hours that you buy from the utility every year. And of course, if you have a franchise and you have 200 or 200 or 400 little outlets somewhere, you need to, of course, consolidate the invoices, the electricity bills from 400 outlets. But it's the same logic, right? Just adding up the kilowatt hours or megawatt hours of electricity. And later on, we'll see how to multiply them with the right factor. And only Scope 3. That's really a little bit of a tricky one, because Scope 3, as we said, is emissions I get from my supplier or I get by people using my products or sending the products in. But if the majority of your emissions come from Scope 3 emissions, then you must include them, because you cannot say, oh, it's not my problem, right? If it's more than 40%, you need to include them. And I mean, there are 15 categories, 8 upstream, 7 downstream that you need to think about. And by right, you should look into every single one, quantify every single one of them, and decide what are the emissions from each source. In practice, I mean, you know your business. You can be much more hypothesis driven. You know your business, you know where you spend most money, who are your big suppliers, etc. So when you collect activity data about Scope 3 emissions, be very focused on what you as the management or the accountant or controlling team of the company know. Right? If I'm a service provider, a consulting company, accountant, auditor, corporate secretary, I don't burn anything. I don't have Scope 1 emissions. If I burn something went wrong, right? My emissions come from business travel, employee commute, and maybe, yeah, that's it. Electricity is already covered in Scope 1. Maybe I buy a little bit of paper, some purchase goods. But if I'm a service company, I already know what are my main sources of Scope 3 emissions. The other way around, if I'm a construction company or property developer, I know, I mean, a lot of my emissions come from purchase goods, right? Cement, steel, roof tiles, wood, piping, etc. All these come with a CO2 footprint. I know I have capital goods, I have trucks, I have excavators, cranes, right? And I know also emissions come from the use of my product. So I can already be quite focused. I just look into my accounts payables. Who are my big suppliers for what kind of materials? That's where the emissions are most likely coming from. Or different example, if you're an equipment manufacturer, doing the aircon, producing the aircon or the fan, you know, right, there's a plastic housing, there's a fan in there, electrical control, copper wires, etc. I know already what are the purchased goods and services that contribute to the carbon footprint, but also I need to think about what is the carbon footprint of my customers using the product. And if it's difficult to treat it at the end of life, like a fridge, I also need to think about the emissions from treating the fridge when it's dismantled afterwards. So this already gives you an idea that even though Scope 3 emissions seem daunting, I mean, you know your business, you know where the emissions are likely coming from because they're coming from your biggest suppliers and from your biggest off-takers. And even if you look into a few annual reports or sustainability reports of competitors, you will see where their emissions come from. Now you still need to calculate. And in theory, you can do it manually. You can say, okay, now I know I consume 500 liters of diesel. I multiply 500 liters with a carbon footprint or the emission factor, and I come to a result. And you literally do this one by one. But there's a long experience, 30 years of experience of doing these calculations. So you don't need to invent it from scratch. No need to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of public sources in the Q&A. Some people ask for public resources. The one that I would always suggest is the greenhouse gas emission calculation tool by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. You see it in the footnote, and there is a link underneath there. This is the publicly available information that helps you calculate greenhouse gas emissions for Scope 1 and some Scope 3 with all the default factors in there. As I said, you don't need to worry, right? What is the methane emissions of a car if it has a small little amount of methane, right? It's mainly CO2, and such a tool can take care of it. So don't reinvent anything from scratch. Look into tools that are readily available. And I just used a small example. I copied in a few screenshots for the example of mobile combustion. Mobile combustion meaning if I have vehicles driving around in my operations, right? And in this Excel file, you just need to collect the activity data we mentioned earlier on. You need to understand what vehicle is it, how much fuel does it use, what's the distance that it travels. And if I know what vehicle it is, the tool will even give me automatically what is the approximate fuel efficiency and emissions, right? And I quite literally could say, okay, I filled it in manually and copied in the screenshots now. I have 2 trucks, right? Diesel light duty trucks, like the bread trucks, the bread delivery that I described earlier on. Then there's a company car, and then there's another company car. One of them measures the information by liters, the other one by kilometers. And if I know I put in whether it's a gasoline car, diesel fuel, I put in how many liters the vehicle uses, how many kilometers I drive. If I only know the kilometers, it's a car of the boss. He doesn't want to tell me the liters. He only gives me mileage at the end of the year. But if I use this tool, it calculates the total emissions in CO2e, CO2 equivalent that my vehicles produce, right? And I can immediately see, which vehicle actually produces what and how much, right? And if I want to afterwards lower my emission footprint, where should I focus? Should I replace one of these trucks with a more fuel efficient truck, etc.? So that is mobile combustion of my core vehicles that fall into Scope 1. Scope 2, unfortunately, tools like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol do not include the emission factors of the Malaysian energy sector. But ultimately, as I said, it's not difficult, right? There are 3 electricity companies at Tenaga, Sarawak Energy, and Sabah Electricity, and they publish the emission intensities. You will find them in their homepages, you will find them in their annual reports. You can see how many emissions they produce per ton of, per megawatt hour or kilowatt hour. And you can easily calculate it with these kind of tools. Lastly, if you use an Excel tool like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, I mean, it's not perfect for Malaysia, right? The Scope 2 emissions are not properly reflected for Malaysia in there. But still, if I put in my stationary and mobile combustion and some of the Scope 3 transport emissions, it would look like this, right? It can give me per year the emissions for mobile combustion, for purchased electricity, etc. And literally, you could ask, doing your mini Excel spreadsheet by now, based on these kind of default factors, to keep track of what are my emissions, my main sources of emissions in my company. And of course, then still the important that you need to analyze them, right? You need to think about, okay, what does it mean now? Because if you have 5,000 tons of emissions of CO2, it doesn't tell you a lot. You need to put it into any relation to a value that is relevant for you, being it carbon intensity, like per kilowatt hour, or per square meter of floor size of your service company, per full-time equivalent, etc., so that you can make it measurable and comparable. And you ultimately need to somehow make it also a discussion basis for the management to do something with. It doesn't need to look nice, right? It doesn't need to be like these kind of examples. It can be very basic, right? It can be an Excel file. It can be a nice accounting Excel file that says, oh, scope 2, this is what I can do about electricity. Maybe I put solar panels on my roof. Maybe I buy green electricity of my from Tenaga. I need to think about end-of-life treatment. So it can be a fairly simple kind of tool to show where are the sources of my emissions, with one goal at the end that you can, based on this simple calculation, take the decision, how do I reduce my emissions? Where do I focus? Do I focus on scope 2, on electricity? Do I focus on raw materials, etc.? And we really, really encourage you to start doing this as soon as possible, because as mentioned earlier on, sooner or later, one of your customers will ask you, if you're export oriented, an international customer will ask you, somebody might ask you the question, what is your CO2 emissions? How high are they? And can you promise me that you will lower them over the next 1 to 5 years? And we want you to be prepared for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Tobias, and thanks so much, Margie. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of today's webinar. And we really hope that you have enjoyed it and learned a lot from this. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first in a series of webinars that we will be producing for SMEs on corporate sustainability. So if you would like to attend subsequent events, please do follow our LinkedIn page, where we will be posting all of our events going forward. As you click the leave button to leave today's seminar, you will find a feedback form, and we'd really appreciate if you could take the time to just fill that up, because it will show us how we should frame the future events that we do. We've also taken note of your questions and comments that we couldn't get to today, and we'll make sure that this is addressed in our future events. So with that, thanks again to our wonderful speakers, and thank you to all of you for tuning in. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.